You have 72 hours to remove that animal, or I will have it forcibly removed and euthanized myself. Karen's voice echoed through the peaceful hallway of Sunset Grove condominiums, her finger jabbing toward the trembling elderly woman clutching an orange tabby cat. What started as a simple wellness check would become a war that exposed the darkest corners of HOA Tyranny, the unbreakable bond between a widow and the only family she had left. Margaret Chen had lived in Unit 212 of Sunset Grove condominiums for 17 years. At 72 years old, she'd watched the neighborhood transform from a quiet retirement community into something else entirely, especially after Karen Morrison took over as HOA President 3 years ago. The morning of April 15th, 2024, started like any other. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair by the window, warm sunlight streaming across her lap where Whiskers, her 9-year-old orange tabby, purred contentedly. The cat's rhythmic breathing and soft warmth were the only things that made mornings bearable anymore, especially since Harold had passed away 18 months ago. "Good morning, my sweet boy," Margaret whispered, stroking Whiskers' head. The cat responded with a gentle head bump against her palm, his golden eyes blinking slowly in that way that cat lovers know means "I love you." Whiskers wasn't just a pet. He was a certified emotional support animal, prescribed by Dr. Elizabeth Torres after Harold's death, when Margaret's grief had become so overwhelming she could barely function. The letter from Dr. Torres sat in Margaret's file cabinet, official and legal, explaining that Whiskers was medically necessary for Margaret's mental health treatment, but Karen Morrison didn't care about letters or doctors or federal housing laws. The knock on Margaret's door came at 9:30 in the morning sharp. Aggressive, demanding. Margaret carefully set Whiskers on the armchair and shuffled to the door, her arthritis making each step painful. Through the peephole she saw Karen's distorted face, already twisted in its perpetual scowl. "Mrs. Chen, open this door immediately. This is an official HOA inspection." Margaret's heart sank. She'd been dreading this moment for months, ever since Karen had announced her new compliance initiative, random inspections to ensure residents were following every obscure rule in the HOA's Byzantine regulations. With shaking hands, Margaret opened the door. Karen stood there in her trademark navy power suit, her dark hair styled in that severe bob that made her look like she was permanently ready for battle. Her sharp features seemed even more angular than usual, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Mrs. Chen, I'm here for your scheduled compliance inspection," Karen announced, pushing past Margaret without waiting for an invitation. I didn't know I was scheduled for today," Margaret stammered, following Karen into her own living room. "All residents are subject to random inspections. It's in Section 12, subsection 43, paragraph 8 of the HOA regulations." Karen's eyes swept the room with predatory efficiency, searching for violations. And then she saw him. Whiskers sat on the armchair, his orange fur glowing in the sunlight, his tail curled neatly around his paws. He regarded Karen with the typical feline indifference that cats reserve for people they instinctively know are not cat people. Karen's face transformed. Her eyes widened, then narrowed into slits. Her jaw clenched. When she spoke, her voice was dangerously quiet. "Is that a cat?" "Yes. This is He's my emotional support. I don't care what you call it," Karen interrupted, her voice rising. "Pets are strictly forbidden in Sunset Grove condominiums. Section 4, subsection 2, paragraph 1. No dogs, no cats, no birds, no reptiles, no animals of any kind, except fish in tanks, no larger than 10 gallons. Margaret felt tears prickling at her eyes. "But Karen, he's not a pet. He's a certified emotional support animal. I have documentation from my doctor." "I don't want to hear your excuses." Karen's face was flushing red now, her professional facade cracking to reveal the bully beneath. "The rules are the rules, and they apply to everyone equally. This is exactly the kind of entitled behavior that erodes community standards." She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of Whiskers from multiple angles, as if documenting evidence at a crime scene. Whiskers, sensing the tension, jumped down from the chair and rubbed against Margaret's legs, offering comfort the way he'd been trained to do. "Stop that animal from touching me." Karen shrieked, jumping back even though Whiskers was nowhere near her. "This is a health hazard. Do you know how many diseases cats carry? Toxoplasmosis, cat scratch fever. Ringworm. This entire unit is probably contaminated. Whiskers is perfectly healthy." Margaret sighed, her voice stronger now. "He's vaccinated. He's clean, and he's certified. The Fair Housing Act protects my right to have him here." Karen's laugh was cold and sharp. "Oh, you want to talk about laws? Let me educate you about HOA regulations, Mrs. Chen. When you signed your purchase agreement and the HOA covenants, you agreed to abide by our rules. Those rules supersede your feelings and your doctor's little notes." She stepped closer to Margaret, using her height advantage to loom over the smaller woman. "You have 72 hours to remove that animal, or I will have it forcibly removed and euthanized myself. And before you think about calling any lawyers, let me remind you that fighting the HOA will cost you thousands in legal fees I know you don't have on your fixed income." Margaret's hands were shaking now. "This cat is all I have left of my family. After Harold died, I don't care about your sob story," Karen snapped. "Everyone has problems, Mrs. Chen. The difference between you and responsible residents is that responsible residents don't think their problems give them the right to break the rules." She walked to the door, then turned back with a cruel smile. 72 hours, and if I see that animal anywhere on HOA property after that deadline, I will personally call animal control and have it removed. They'll take it to the shelter, and we both know what happens to 9-year-old cats at the shelter." The door slammed behind her, leaving Margaret standing in the middle of her living room, tears streaming down her face. Whiskers meowed softly and jumped back into her lap as she collapsed into her armchair. The cat pressed his head against her chest, purring loudly, trying to comfort her the way he'd been trained to do. "What are we going to do, Whiskers?" Margaret whispered into his soft fur. What are we going to do? By that afternoon, Margaret's phone was ringing constantly. Karen had wasted no time spreading the word about the Ijela Lanimalin Unit 212. "Margaret, this is Sylvia from Unit 105, came the first call. "I just wanted to let you know that Karen sent out an email blast to all residents about your situation. She's calling it a health emergency and a blatant violation of community standards." Margaret's stomach twisted into knots. What did the email say exactly? Sylvia's voice was sympathetic, but worried. "She said you were harboring an illegal animal that posed health and safety risks to all residents. She's asking people to report any sightings of the cat to her immediately." "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I know how much Whiskers means to you." The calls kept coming. Some residents expressed support had lost their own spouses. They understood how lonely the nights could be. They thought Karen was being unnecessarily cruel. But others echoed Karen's concerns about rules and property values and setting dangerous precedents. By evening, Margaret found an official violation notice taped to her door, along with a fine for $300 for unauthorized pet ownership. The notice was typed in aggressive red letters. "Resident Margaret Chen, Unit 212V, Io Lati Ioan. Unauthorized animal on premises in direct violation of HOA covenants. Section 4, Subsection 2, Paragraph 1 FIN. $300 due immediately, corrective action required. Remove animal from premises within 72 hours of this notice, April 15th, 9:45 A.M. Failure to comply, additional fines of $100 per day. Potential legal action, forced removal of animal, potential foreclosure proceedings. This is your only warning. The HOA Board takes violations of community standards seriously and will pursue all legal remedies available." Karen Morrison, HOA President Margaret's hands shook as she read the notice. Foreclosure? They could actually take her home. That night, Margaret barely slept. Whiskers curled up on Harold's side of the bed like he always did, his warm presence a reminder of everything she stood to lose. She thought about Harold, about the day he'd brought Whiskers home from the shelter 7 years ago. "I know we said no pets," Harold had said, carrying the scrawny kitten in his arms. "But look at him! Maggie, he needed us." And later, after Harold's heart attack, after the funeral, after the endless dark days when Margaret couldn't get out of bed, couldn't eat, couldn't see the point in continuing it, was Whiskers who had saved her. His insistent meowing for food, his demand for attention, his warm body pressed against hers in the dark nights. He gave her a reason to get up each morning. Dr. Torres had recognized it immediately during Margaret's 6-month checkup after Harold's death. "Margaret, you're suffering from complicated grief and clinical depression," the doctor had said gently. "Have you considered getting an emotional support animal? I think it would be highly beneficial for your mental health treatment." The official letter had come a week later, complete with medical documentation and certification. But now Karen was threatening to take all of that away. Around 2 a.m, Margaret heard voices outside her window. She carefully pulled back the curtain and saw Karen standing in the parking lot with 2 other board members, Robert Finch and Patricia Holbrook, both of whom seemed to be nodding along with whatever Karen was saying. Margaret couldn't hear the words, but she could see Karen's animated gestures, the way she kept pointing up toward Margaret's unit, the aggressive satisfaction on her face. They were planning something worse than fines and notices. Whiskers sensed Margaret's distress and climbed onto her chest, kneading gently with his paws and purring his healing purr. Margaret wrapped her arms around him and cried quietly into his fur. "I won't let her take you," she whispered. "I don't care what I have to do. You're my family. You're all I have left." But even as she said the words, Margaret knew the truth. She was a 72-year-old widow on a fixed income, facing off against an HOA president who had unlimited time, unlimited resources, and absolutely no mercy. The war had just begun, and Margaret was terrified. She was going to lose everything. The next morning, Margaret woke to find a new notice on her door, but this one wasn't from Karen. It was from Animal Control, claiming they'd received multiple complaints about a vicious, uncontrolled animal in her unit. The notice informed her that an animal control officer would be conducting a mandatory inspection within 48 hours. Margaret's blood ran cold. Karen hadn't just contacted the HOA board. She'd filed false reports with the city, and if Animal Control declared Whiskers dangerous or improperly housed, they could seize him immediately. No appeal. No second chances. What would you do if someone threatened to take away your only family? Have you ever faced an HOA or neighbor who abused their power? Share your story in the comments below. The Animal Control officer arrived exactly 48 hours later on April 17th at 10 a.m. Margaret had spent those 2 days in a state of constant anxiety, barely eating, barely sleeping, just holding Whiskers and trying to prepare herself for what was coming. Officer James Rodriguez seemed kind enough when Margaret opened the door. He was in his mid-30s, wearing the standard Animal Control uniform and carrying a clipboard thick with paperwork. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Officer Rodriguez. I'm here about the complaints filed regarding an animal in this unit." "Please, come in," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to know that the complaints are false. Whiskers is a certified emotional support animal, and he's perfectly well behaved." Officer Rodriguez stepped inside and looked around the immaculate apartment. Everything was clean, organized, and odor-free. Whiskers sat on his favorite armchair, grooming himself peacefully. "Ma'am, I've received 3 separate complaints in the last 48 hours. Rodriguez said. Reading from his clipboard, the complaints allege that your cat is aggressive, unsanitary, and poses a danger to other residents. They also claim the animal is kept in inhumane conditions. Margaret's eyes widened. "That's completely untrue." "Who filed these complaints?" Rodriguez flipped through his papers. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information, but I can tell you that one complainant claims to be the president and says she witnessed the animal attempting to attack her during an inspection." "That's a lie." Margaret's voice cracked. "Whiskers has never attacked anyone in his entire life. He's the gentlest cat I've ever known. Karen Morrison is lying because she wants to force me to get rid of him." Officer Rodriguez held up his hand gently. "Ma'am, I understand this is emotional, but I need to conduct my inspection. May I examine the animal and the living conditions?" For the next 30 minutes, Officer Rodriguez thoroughly inspected Margaret's apartment. He checked Whiskers' vaccination records, examined the litter box area, looked at the cat's food and water stations, and even picked up Whiskers to check his physical condition. Whiskers, being the therapy cat he was trained to be, purred and rubbed against Officer Rodriguez's arms, showing absolutely no signs of aggression. "Mrs. Chun, Rodriguez finally said, setting Whiskers down gently. "I'm going to be honest with you. There is absolutely nothing wrong here. Your cat is healthy, well cared for, affectionate, and your apartment is cleaner than most places I inspect. These complaints are clearly fraudulent." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. "So you'll tell Karen that there's no problem." Rodriguez's expression turned sympathetic but troubled. "I'll file my report, stating that I found no evidence of the alleged violations. However, I need to warn you about something. Whoever filed these complaints, and I think we both know who that was, they're not going to stop here. I've seen cases like this before where HOA boards use animal control as a weapon against residents they want to harass. What can I do?" Margaret asked desperately. "Document everything. Keep copies of all your medical paperwork regarding Whisker's status as an emotional support animal. If you can afford it, consult with a lawyer who specializes in Fair Housing Act cases, and—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better." After Officer Rodriguez left, Margaret sat down at her small desk and began organizing her documents. She pulled out Dr. Torres's letter, Whisker's certification, his vaccination records, everything that proved her legal right to have him. But even as she organized the papers with shaking hands, she knew Rodriguez was right. This was only the beginning. Karen's next move came that same afternoon. Margaret was taking Whiskers to the designated pet relief area behind the building, a small patch of grass that the HOA had grudgingly installed years ago for service animals. Whiskers was on his harness and leash, walking calmly beside Margaret when Karen appeared seemingly out of nowhere. "What do you think you're doing?" Karen's voice was sharp and accusing. Margaret jumped, startled. "I'm taking Whiskers to the relief area. He needs that area is for service animals only, not illegal pets." Karen pulled out her phone and began recording. "I'm documenting this violation right now. You're using facilities designated for legitimate service animals with your unauthorized cat. Emotional support animals are protected under," Margaret began. "I don't care about your fake paperwork." Karen circled them with her phone, getting footage from every angle. Everyone can get one of those bogus letters from some quack doctor online. Real service animals are trained professionals, not pampered pets that entitled people use to break the rules. Whiskers, sensing Margaret's distress, pressed against her legs and meowed softly. "See? It's being aggressive," Karen announced to her phone camera. "The animal is clearly agitated and poses a threat to community safety. He's not being aggressive. He's comforting me because you're upsetting me." Margaret's voice rose, tears streaming down her face now. Other residents had begun to gather, watching the confrontation. Some looked sympathetic to Margaret, others seemed to side with Karen, but most just looked uncomfortable and unsure. "Señora Chen is in violation of multiple HOA regulations," Karen announced loudly, playing to her audience. "She refuses to comply with lawful orders to remove an illegal animal. She's using facilities reserved for legitimate service animals, and she's becoming verbally aggressive and unstable, which raises serious concerns about her fitness to continue living in this community." "You can't kick me out of my home," Margaret cried. "I've lived here for 17 years. Karen smiled coldly. "The HOA board has the authority to remove residents who pose a danger to community welfare, and your increasingly erratic behavior, combined with your refusal to follow rules, suggests you may no longer be capable of maintaining appropriate conduct in a shared living environment." Margaret felt the world tilting around her. This wasn't just about Whiskers anymore. Karen was building a case to have her declared mentally unfit, to force her out of her home entirely. "You're a monster," Margaret whispered. "No, Mrs. Chen. I'm a property manager doing my job to protect property values and community standards. There's a difference." Karen stopped recording and leaned in close, lowering her voice so only Margaret could hear. "You should have just gotten rid of the cat when I gave you the chance. Now you're going to lose everything: the cat, your home, and what little dignity you have left." She walked away, leaving Margaret standing there, shaking. Whiskers pressed against her legs, and a dozen neighbors, watching with varying degrees of pity and discomfort. Over the next week, Karen's harassment campaign intensified with terrifying efficiency. Margaret received violation notices for everything imaginable. Her welcome mat was allegedly half an inch too wide. Her window treatments were the wrong shade of white. She'd placed her recycling bin out 6 minutes after the designated time. Her car was supposedly leaking oil in the parking space. It wasn't. Each violation came with a fine. $50 here, $100 there. By April 24th, Margaret had accumulated over $800 in fines that she couldn't possibly afford on her modest Social Security income. But the worst part wasn't the money. Karen had begun a whisper campaign throughout the building, suggesting that Margaret was mentally unstable, that she was hoarding animals. She had exactly one cat, that she was letting the cat roam the building, spreading disease. Whiskers never left her apartment, except for supervised trips to the relief area. Margaret noticed residents avoiding eye contact with her in the hallways. Some clutched their purses tighter when she walked by, as if she might suddenly attack them. Parents pulled their children closer when she entered the elevator. The isolation was crushing. On April 26th, Margaret woke up unable to breathe properly. Her chest felt tight. Her heart was racing, and the room spun around her. Whiskers immediately jumped onto her chest, his purring becoming louder and more insistent. The way he was trained to respond to Margaret's anxiety attacks. But this time, even Whiskers' comfort wasn't enough. Margaret managed to call 911 before she passed out. She woke up in the hospital 6 hours later, Dr. Torres sitting beside her bed with a concerned expression. "Margaret, you had a severe panic attack that triggered a cardiac event," Dr. Torres explained gently. "Your blood pressure was dangerously high, and your stress levels are off the charts. What's been going on?" Through tears, Margaret told her everything: Karen's threats, the harassment campaign, the mounting fines, the isolation, the fear of losing both Whiskers and her home. Dr. Torres listened with increasing alarm, making notes on her tablet. "Margaret, this is serious. The stress you're under is literally life-threatening. Your body can't sustain this level of anxiety." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I need to update your ESA documentation to include specific language about the medical necessity of Whiskers for your cardiovascular health, as well as your mental health, and I'm going to recommend you speak with a lawyer immediately." "I can't afford a lawyer," Margaret said weakly. "There are legal aid organizations that handle Fair Housing Act cases, pro bono," Dr. Torres said firmly. "I'm going to make some calls before you're discharged." "This woman is killing you, Margaret. We need to stop her." While Margaret was in the hospital, something else was happening back at Sunset Grove condominiums. A resident named Thomas Walsh, a retired attorney who lived in Unit 309, had been watching Karen's campaign against Margaret with growing disgust. Thomas had his own history with HOA. Abused his previous community, had tried to foreclose on him over a bogus fine structure until he fought back legally. He knew exactly what Karen was doing, and he wasn't going to let it continue. Thomas began making calls to other residents, particularly those who'd expressed sympathy for Margaret. What he discovered shocked him. Karen had been running similar harassment campaigns against at least 4 other residents over the past 2 years. An elderly veteran with PTSD who had a service dog, a single mother whose child had autism and needed specific accommodations, a resident in a wheelchair who'd requested minor modifications to her unit entrance. Each time, Karen had made their lives so miserable that they'd either given in to her demands or moved out entirely. It was a pattern of abuse, and Thomas was determined to document every instance of it. On April 28th, while Margaret was still in the hospital recovering, Thomas organized a secret meeting in his unit with 12 other residents who'd witnessed Karen's behavior or experienced it themselves. "We need to understand something," Thomas told the gathered group. "What Karen is doing isn't just cruel, it's illegal. The Fair Housing Act protects residents with disabilities who need emotional support, animals or service animals. By harassing Margaret, Karen is exposing this entire HOA to massive federal liability." "But Karen said the HOA rules supersede federal law," Patricia Holbrook interjected. She was one of the board members who'd been nodding along with Karen in the parking lot, but now she looked worried. "Karen lied to you," Thomas said bluntly. "Federal law always supersedes HOA covenants. Always. If Margaret decides to sue, and she would have every right to, this HOA could face hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and damages. Your property values won't just decrease, they'll plummet." and every single board member who participated in this harassment could be held personally liable. The room went silent as the implications sank in. "So what do we do?" asked Sylvie Chun. No relation to Margaret, but equally horrified by Karen's behavior. Thomas smiled grimly. "We start by documenting everything Karen has done. Then we call an emergency board meeting to remove her as president. And then we help Margaret fight back." But Karen had been listening. She'd suspected that residents might turn against her, so she'd had security cameras installed throughout the common areas without board approval or resident notification. She'd watched Thomas organizing his meeting on the hidden camera feed. And now, as she sat in her unit reviewing the footage, Karen's face twisted into a expression of pure rage. If the residents wanted war, she would give them war. That night, Karen filed a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services, claiming that Margaret Chen was mentally incompetent and unable to care for herself, and that her emotional attachment to the cat was evidence of delusional thinking that posed a danger to herself and others. The complaint would trigger an investigation that could result in Margaret being declared legally incompetent and placed under a conservator supplying control of her life, her finances, and her home forever. Has anyone ever weaponized bureaucracy against you or someone you love? How far would you go to protect your family? Margaret returned home from the hospital on April 30th to find a certified letter waiting for her. Her hands shook as she opened it, whiskers rubbing anxiously against her legs. The letter explained that APS had received a complaint alleging that Margaret Chen was unable to care for herself properly, was exhibiting signs of mental incompetence, and was living in potentially unsafe conditions. An investigator would arrive within 72 hours to assess her living situation and mental capacity. Margaret collapsed onto a sofa, the letter falling from her hands. This was it. Karen had found a way to have her declared They could take everything: her home, her independence, her cat. Mrs. Chen. A knock on the door interrupted her spiral of panic. "It's Thomas Walsh, from Unit 309. I need to talk to you about something urgent." Margaret opened the door to find Thomas standing there with a briefcase and a determined expression. "May I come in? I think I can help you." Over the next hour, Thomas explained everything: the secret meeting, the pattern of Karen's abuse against other residents, and most importantly, his plan to fight back. "I've contacted a legal aid attorney named Sarah Martinez who specializes in Fair Housing Act violations," Thomas said, pulling documents from his briefcase. "She's agreed to take your case pro bono. But we need to move fast, especially with this apps investigation." "Why are you helping me?" Margaret asked, tears streaming down her face. "You barely know me." Thomas's expression soft. "Because what Karen is doing is wrong. And because I lost my own wife 3 years ago, and I know what it's like when grief makes you feel like you're drowning. If someone had tried to take away the things that kept me afloat during that time," he shook his head, "nobody should have that kind of power over another person's life." Margaret reached down and picked up Whiskers, holding him close. "What do I need to do? First, we prepare for the apps visit. Your apartment is immaculate. Your medical records are solid, and Dr. Torres is writing a supplementary letter explaining that you're completely mentally competent and that Whiskers is essential to your health. Second, we gather evidence of Karen's harassment campaign. And third," Thomas smiled, "we call an emergency HOA board meeting. The apps investigator, a woman named Janet Morisano, relation to Karen, arrived on May 2nd. She was professional, thorough, and fair. She interviewed Margaret extensively, toured the apartment, examined Margaret's medical records, spoke with Dr. Torres by phone, and spent 20 minutes observing Margaret's interactions with Mrs. Chen. Janet finally said, "I'm going to recommend that this case be closed. You are clearly mentally competent. Your living conditions are excellent, and your relationship with your emotional support animal is healthy and therapeutic. Whoever filed this complaint," she paused diplomatically, "may have had inaccurate information about your situation." Margaret nearly collapsed with relief. "So they can't take him away?" "Not based on my investigation. No. However, I do need to note in my report that you're experiencing significant external stressors that are affecting your health. I'm recommending that you continue working with Dr. Torres and consider seeking legal counsel regarding the harassment you described." After Janet left, Margaret called Thomas immediately. "The app's investigation cleared me," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Excellent. That's one battle won. Now we move to the next phase." Thomas's voice was firm and confident. "The emergency board meeting is scheduled for May 5th at 7 p.m. in the community room. I've convinced enough residents to attend that Karen can't control the narrative anymore." Meanwhile, Thomas and his group of concerned residents had been busy. They'd gathered testimony from the 4 other residents Karen had harassed into submission. They'd documented every violation notice Margaret had received and cross-referenced them with HOA bylaws. Most of the violations were either fabricated or applied selectively. They'd reviewed the HOA's financial records and discovered something shocking. Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, her security camera system, her legal consultation fees for matters unrelated to HOA business, even her dry cleaning bills. Over 3 years, she'd embezzled nearly $15,000 from HOA accounts. "This is fraud," Sara Martinez, the legal aid attorney, confirmed when Thomas showed her the evidence. "This is beyond just Fair Housing Act violations. This is criminal behavior." But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Robert Finch, one of the board members who'd been supporting Karen, had a crisis of conscience. He approached Thomas privately on May 4th with a flash drive. "I've been recording board meetings for the past year," Robert admitted, looking ashamed. "At first, it was just for note-taking purposes. But then, Karen started saying things that made me uncomfortable. I kept recording because I wanted to document what was happening in case things went wrong." The recordings were devastating. In one meeting, Karen explicitly stated, "We need to make examples of residents who think they're special. If we let Shun keep her cat, every other resident will think they can break the rules too. We need to make her so miserable she either gets rid of the animal or moves out." In another recording, Karen discussed her strategy. "If we can get her declared mentally incompetent through we can force a sale of her unit and get someone in there who actually respects authority." Thomas listened to the recordings with growing anger. "Robert, why didn't you speak up sooner?" "I was afraid," Robert admitted. Karen made it clear that anyone who opposed her would become her next target. "I thought if I just went along with it, stayed quiet, I'd be safe. I was wrong. What she's doing is evil, and I can't be part of it anymore." May 5th arrived with an electric tension throughout Sunset Grove condominiums. The community room was packed with over 60 residents, far more than had attended any board meeting in years. Margaret sat in the front row, Whiskers in his carrier beside her, Thomas on her other side. Karen arrived precisely at 7 p.m. Dressed in her most authoritative power suit, her severe bob styled perfectly, her expression radiating confidence. She clearly expected this to be another meeting she would dominate and control. She was wrong. Thomas stood up before Karen could call the meeting to order. "Point of order. Madam President, under HOA Bylaws, Article 7, Section 3, any resident can call for an emergency vote of no confidence in board leadership if they can present evidence of malfeasance. I am formally calling for such a vote, and I have the required signatures from 20% of residents to force this issue." Karen's confident expression faltered. "You can't just—" "Actually, I can," Thomas said calmly, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "And I have evidence that requires immediate board attention and possible criminal referral." For the next 30 minutes, Thomas systematically presented the case against Karen, the harassment campaign against Margaret and 4 other residents, including recorded conversations proving intentional discrimination against residents with disabilities, the embezzlement of HOA funds, with detailed financial records showing unauthorized expenses, the illegal installation of security cameras in common areas without board approval or resident notification, the filing of false reports with Animal Control and Adult Protective Services, the selective and arbitrary enforcement of HOA rules to target specific residents. With each revelation, the residents' murmuring grew louder. Karen's face grew paler. When Thomas played the audio recordings of Karen explicitly plotting to drive Margaret out of her home, several residents gasped audibly. Sarah Martinez, the attorney, stood up next. "Ladies and gentlemen, what Ms. Morrison has done constitutes multiple violations of Federal Fair Housing Act provisions. Mrs. Chen, as a person with disabilities who requires an emotional support animal, is protected under federal law. The HOAS attempts to force removal of her emotional support animal, combined with the documented harassment campaign, exposes this community to significant legal liability." She paused for effect. If Mrs. Chen were to file a federal lawsuit, she would be fully justified in doing this. HOA could face damages in excess of $500,000, plus attorney's fees and ongoing federal oversight. Your property values would be destroyed. Your HOA fees would skyrocket to cover legal costs, and every board member who participated in or enabled this harassment could face personal liability. The room erupted into chaos. Residents were shouting questions, demanding answers, looking at Karen with expressions ranging from shock to fury. Patricia Olbrock, the other board member, stood up with tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know," she said, her voice shaking. "Karen told us that Margaret was breaking the rules, that we had to enforce them equally, that the cat was illegal. She never told us about the emotional support animal documentation. She never mentioned the Fair Housing Act. I thought we were doing the right thing." Karen finally found her voice. "This is a conspiracy. These people are trying to destroy me because I actually enforced the rules instead of letting this community become a Yes, I was harsh with Mrs. Chen, but someone has to maintain standards. You embezzled $15,000, Thomas said quietly. You filed false reports with government agencies. You violated federal anti-discrimination laws. This isn't about standards, Karen. This is about you abusing your power to hurt vulnerable people." The vote was called. 53 residents voted to immediately remove Karen Morrison as HOA president and from the board entirely. 3 residents voted to keep her. 4 abstained. Karen stood there, her face frozen in shock, as the reality of her downfall sank in. Then, without a word, she grabbed her purse and walked out of the community room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She would never return to a board meeting again. But Karen wasn't done yet. That night, as Margaret slept peacefully with Whiskers curled beside her for the first time in weeks without nightmares, Karen sat in her unit composing an email to her Kuzana reporter at the local news station. HOA resident weaponizes disability to keep illegal pet community torn apart. She typed, if she was going down, she would take Margaret with her. The media storm was about to begin. Have you ever watched a bully face consequences for their actions? What do you think Karen will do next? The morning of May 7th, Margaret woke to her phone ringing incessantly. Outside her window, she could see a news van parked in the visitor spaces. Mrs. Chen, this is Channel 7 News. We'd like to get your statement about the controversy surrounding your illegal pet and the claims that you've been manipulating disability laws to Margaret hung up without listening to the rest. Within hours, Karen's version of events was spreading across local news and social media. The headlines were brutal. Resident uses emotional support animal loophole to break. HOA rules community divided over woman's fake disability claim. HOA president fired for enforcing rules. Against entitled resident Karen had spun the entire story, portraying herself as a dedicated volunteer trying to maintain community standards. Unfairly attacked by a resident who was abusing disability protections, Margaret watched the news coverage with growing horror. Whiskers sensing her distress and pressing against her side, but Thomas and Sarah Martinez were already mobilizing a counter-response. Sarah contacted every news outlet with a detailed statement, including copies of Dr. Teresa's medical documentation, the AP's investigation clearance, and most damaging to Karen's narrative, the audio recordings of Karen explicitly plotting to drive Margaret out. Let's be crystal clear about what happened here, Sarah told Channel 7's investigative reporter, Margaret Chen. Karen Morrison didn't lose her position for enforcing rules. She was removed for violating federal anti-discrimination laws, embezzling HOA funds, and filing false reports with government agencies. We have documented evidence of all of this, and we're prepared to release it publicly. Margaret Chen, a veteran investigative journalist, recognized a real story when he saw one. He requested interviews with Thomas, Margaret, Dr. Torres, and reviewed all the documentation. The follow-up story that aired on May 9th changed everything. An investigation by Channel 7 has uncovered evidence that the former president accused of unfairly targeting a disabled resident may have actually been engaged in a systematic pattern of harassment and financial fraud. The story included excerpts from the damning audio recordings, interviews with the 4 other residents Karen had harassed, and expert legal analysis explaining Fair Housing Act protections. By May 10th, Karen's narrative had completely collapsed. The public opinion shifted dramatically. Social media posts that had initially supported Karen were being deleted or edited. Residents who'd defended her were back. Karen herself had gone silent. Her social media accounts deleted, her unit apparently empty most days. On May 15th, exactly 1 month after Karen had first discovered the new interim HOA board held its first official meeting. Thomas had been elected temporary president, with Patricia Holbrook remaining on the board, after a sincere public apology and commitment to do better. The board's first action was to formally rescind all violation notices and fines issued to Margaret Chen. The second action was to revise the covenants to explicitly comply with Fair Housing Act requirements, including clear protections for residents with emotional support, animals, and service animals. The third action was to refer Karen Morrison's financial irregularities to the local district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. On May 22nd, the DA's office announced they were opening a formal investigation into embezzlement and fraud charges against Karen Morrison. But the most important moment came on May 20th. The HOA organized a community gathering in the courtyard, not a formal meeting, but a healing event. Barbecue grills were set up, folding tables held potluck dishes, and residents mingled freely for the first time in years without the oppressive atmosphere Karen had created. Margaret attended with Whiskers in his carrier, nervous about how people would react. She needn't have worried. Resident after resident approached her to apologize for not speaking up sooner, some to thank her for standing firm, some just to meet the famous Whiskers who'd sparked a revolution. "Senora Chen, I'm so sorry I avoided you during all of this," Sylvia said, tears in her eyes. "I was afraid Karen would target me next if I showed you support. That was cowardly of me." "I understand," Margaret said gently. "Fear makes us do things we're not proud of." Children clustered around Whiskers's carrier, delighted by the friendly orange cat who purred and rubbed against the bars. Parents who'd once pulled their kids away now encouraged them to gently pet him. Dr. Torres had come as Margaret's guest, and she watched the scene with professional satisfaction. "This is exactly what Whiskers was meant to do," she told Thomas quietly. "Therapy animals don't just heal individuals, they can heal entire communities. If we let them." Thomas raised his glass of lemonade. "To Whiskers. Then, the cat who saved Sunset Grove." As the sun set that evening, Margaret sat on a bench in the courtyard, Whiskers on her lap, surrounded by neighbors who were becoming friends. For the first time since Harold's death, she felt truly part of a community again. November brought cooler weather and remarkable changes to Sunset Grove condominiums. Karen Morrison had pled guilty to embezzlement charges and received 2 years probation, community service, and was ordered to repay the $15,000 she'd stolen. She'd sold her unit and moved out of state, reportedly to live with family. The interim board had become permanent, with Thomas as president and 3 new members who genuinely cared about community welfare rather than power. The revised HOA covenants were now considered a model policy, with other communities requesting copies to update their own rules. Most importantly, Sunset Grove had transformed from a place of fear and isolation into an actual community. Margaret had started a weekly tea group in the community room, which had grown to include 15 regular attendees, mostly widows and widowers who'd found companionship and support in each other. 3 other residents had gotten emotional support animals after seeing Margaret's experience, and the HOA had supported each one without question. Whiskers had become something of a therapy cat for the entire building. Residents would ask Margaret if they could visit him, especially when they were having difficult days. He seemed to sense when people needed comfort, offering his healing purrs freely. On Thanksgiving, Margaret hosted a small dinner in her unit. Thomas, Sylvia, Dr. Torres, and Sarah Martinez, the attorney who'd become a friend. As they went around the table sharing what they were grateful for, Margaret looked down at Whiskers, curled contentedly in her lap, and felt her eyes filled with tears. "I'm grateful for this little orange warrior," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Harold brought him home 7 years ago, and I thought he was just a cat. But he turned out to be so much more. He saved me from my grief. He gave me a reason to fight when I thought I had nothing left. And somehow, he helped turn this entire community into a family." She looked around at the faces of her friends, people who'd stood by her when it mattered most. "But mostly, I'm grateful that standing up for love, Yvonne, love for a cat can change the world." Whiskers meowed softly, as if in agreement, and everyone laughed. Outside the window, the sun set over Sunset Grove condominiums, casting warm, golden light over a community that had learned the hard way that rules without compassion are just tyranny. But compassion without courage means nothing at all. And in Unit 212, an elderly woman and her orange tabby cat lived peacefully ever after, surrounded by friends who would never let anyone threaten their family again. Sometimes the smallest, most vulnerable beings teach us the biggest lessons about courage, love, and standing up for what's right. Have you ever had a pet that changed your life? Share your story in the comments below.